Despite all their productivity, the Incas managed without money or marketplaces. So how were they able to do this? The secret of the Incas' great wealth may have been their unusual tax system. As I've mentioned before, instead of paying taxes in money form, every Inca commoner was required to provide labor to the state. And in exchange for this labor, they were given the necessities of life. So in this lecture, you're going to learn about this labor system as well as the various different other Inca means of economy, trade, and industry. The Inca economy bore very little resemblance to the monetary-based free market economies found in most countries today. Agriculture served as the backbone of the economy, with the Inca central government controlling almost all of the economic activity, including the production, circulation, and consumption of goods. Now, believe it or not, no form of currency existed, nor was there a concept of purchasing or ownership of commodities. Essentially, the government controlled the allocation and redistribution of all resources, meaning the government was the primary means by which people received their basic necessities to live. As I just mentioned, agriculture served as the backbone to the empire, and agriculture was not new to the Inca. It's been practiced in the Andes since around 3000 BCE and along the coast since 1800 BCE. Agriculture did, however, reach unprecedented levels under the Inca, and this was achieved through the construction of canals, agricultural terraces, diverting rivers, and the draining of swamplands. Now, agriculture was practiced in every altitude zone that supported plant life, so up to around 13,123 feet, with the greatest crop diversity found in the river valleys along the coast. So, how were these crops tended to and cared for? Probably the primary tool was the taquia, or foot plow. This was a wooden rod with a curved top and a footrest used for breaking up the soil, as seen here in the picture on the left. Additionally, hoes and clod breakers were also important implements in the farmer's toolkit. So staple crops for the Inca included maize and potato, but they also grew tomatoes, chili peppers, gourds, and fruits, for example. Each specific crop can only be grown under certain climatic and altitudinal zones. For example, maize, cotton, chili peppers, coca, peanuts, beans, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, and avocados all thrive in warmer climates less than 3,000 feet. So regardless of where you grew your crops, the most important technologies were terracing and irrigation, which were the primary means by which the Inca ensured their agricultural success. I know we've discussed terracing briefly when we had the architecture lecture, but I wanted to reiterate it here. This concept was not original to the Inca, as the practice began around 2500 BCE. Basically, terracing is the leveling of mountainsides adjacent to a valley floor into a series of steps, creating a flat surface area. Each step could hold a few rows up to hundreds of rows of crops. For example, some terraces stretched 5,000 feet of land. This method cuts down on soil erosion caused by winds, rain, and snow, but maximized the amount of exposure to the sun. Now, retaining walls and canals constitute the architecture of terraces and were made out of cut stone or dry masonry, which held the terraces in place. Additionally, the canals on the sides of the terraces allowed for excess water to run off. Irrigation in general began with the Moche and Chimu, but reached unprecedented levels of technological sophistication under the Inca. In fact, control over water was key to the Inca expansion. In some locations, irrigation ditches ran for several kilometers, which allowed for the maintenance of agricultural fields in previously uninhabitable land. Now, evidence of drainage systems, especially in the highlands, have been found in Inca road systems. Basically, drainages were placed at the center of roads to prevent flooding. They have also been excavated along the perimeters of buildings to catch rainwater falling from the roof, as well as open drainage channels found around buildings, ceremonial platforms, and plazas. Evidence of irrigation practice takes several forms, including canals for moving water around terraces and sunken gardens. Sunken gardens were utilized by coastal peoples as well as those living near Lake Titicaca. These sunken gardens, called cochas, were used frequently in drier environments and were created by digging a hole in the ground close to a water source and then planting crops inside. This allowed for water to seep into the opening, thereby watering the crop. So here's a fun fact. Chroniclers noted that near Chanchan, they used the head of sardines to fertilize the crops within the cochas. This practice was so effective that it is still used today. An additional important economic resource only second to agriculture was mining for ores. The most abundant ores in the region were copper, tin, silver, and gold. And the Inca divided their mineral sources into two major categories: local community mines and major state mines. So metals from community mines were given to the Caraca, while metals and ores from the state mines were given to royal administration, as well as were heavily regulated. Here's an important note. The vast majority of ores were located in the southern Collasuyu, which is comprised of parts of modern-day Bolivia, Chile, and northwest Argentina. Now, more than 75% of the Inca settlements in Collasuyu were dedicated to the mining and processing of ores. Given the fact that the vertical nature of the Inca environment was pretty strenuous, pack animals were necessary for the movement of those metals, foodstuffs, and supplies. The herding of animals typically took place in the high-altitude tundra, which is the natural habitat for llamas and alpacas. Herders allowed the animals to graze on dwarf grasses in a particular area until the grass was depleted. Males typically cared for the llamas. However, adolescent boys and girls often herded as well to fulfill their familial responsibilities. Although they were official property of the government, llamas were tended to and controlled by the community to which the herder belonged. And herders were typically responsible for around 500 llamas and were required to offer them as tribute when necessary. Additionally, byproducts from llamas like fur and meat were also directly given to the government. Like I said, the government controlled every resource. So speaking of animals, hunting grounds were located throughout the Inca Empire, but were reserved for the use by Inca kings and elites. It was considered a prestigious activity imbued with ritual significance, thus it was reserved for royalty. Now, typically hunts took place in high-altitude regions and only occurred periodically. This was done so that the game populations could regenerate from the previous hunt. Now, there are a few written documents concerning a large public organized hunt in 1536, during which 11,000 animals were killed. This hunt was organized by the king and involved hundreds of participants who would create human concentric circles that eventually trapped the animals in a small space for killing effectively in high volumes. Chroniclers actually mentioned that the meat from this hunt was used in royal feasts. Another means of collecting food was through fishing, which was an essential economic activity along the coast, where only 10% of the land was suitable for agriculture. Marine life along the coast was abundant, with a large variety of fish, mollusks, and vegetation. And in fact, aquatic resources were so abundant that fishermen could produce yields 280 days out of the year. So fishermen rowed in narrow reed boats and captured fish with woven nets and copper hooks. The nets ranged in size from small to large-scale ones, which were attached to poles. Marine-based food provided a crucial source of protein, and it was even reported that the Sapa Inca would eat fresh coastal fish, which would be caught in the morning and delivered to the highlands just in time for dinner. I should point out that rivers and lakes also produced fish in the highlands, but very infrequently and not nearly as tasty. Plant life also provided a great source of food for the Inca. They would gather wild plants and insects for both dietary and medicinal purposes. For example, the oca-oca plant would stave off thirst, and the ocapa plant or century plant was used for its fiber for weaving and its fruit for eating, which would be boiled, eaten raw, or used in a tea. Additionally, the Inca would also collect insects like caterpillars, ants, and beetles, which were eaten raw or toasted. I wanted to throw this in here as I often get questions about pets. Yes, they did keep pets for company, but they could also be used as a food source. For example, the cuy, or guinea pig, was an abundant and easily kept animal. They would be kept as pets to eliminate household pests, but would also be eaten in certain regions. For example, they were a primary source of meat among commoners in the highlands. Now, dogs, on the other hand, were seen more as pets, but in times of stress, sadly, they could become a source of food. I want to transition now to speaking about trade and trade networks. Trade networks were essential for circulating goods in an empire built in various terrains. For example, lowland crops like maize, coca, and chili pepper were traded for highland goods like potatoes and jerky. Local and regional trade was managed within an ayllu or by the caracca, whereas large-scale trade was controlled by the state. Now, many large-scale trade items were exotic, so things like bird feathers, and coca. This allowed for the state to control the goods as a form of tribute from conquered lands. So then, what made trade so efficient? Well, that has everything to do with their road system. The Inca road system stretches 2,485 miles of terrain north to south, equaling 15,534 miles to around 18,641 miles of roadway. It's insane. It's a lot. There are two major trunk roads, one in the highlands, the other in the lowlands, and they're called the Capacnan. The Highland Road ran from Quito, Ecuador to Mendoza, Argentina, while the coastal road ran from Tumbes, Ecuador to Chile. Unfortunately, the full extent may never be known as portions of the road have disappeared over time. The grandest highways were paved with cobbles or flagstone and were constructed and maintained by Mita laborers. This is important to note. Only authorized personnel were permitted to use the roads. This included royalty, soldiers, long-distance traders, and the chasquis. These roads facilitated communication throughout the empire, the transportation of goods, and made possible the rapid deployment of troops. Land transportation was carried out typically by foot, while nobility were carried on the back of a person or on a litter. Royal litters could hold up to 2 people at once, and as documented by Guaman de Palma, Inca litters were 2 long poles upon which a roofed seated area was attached, while 4 men would hold the litter. He also noted that the interior and exterior of the litters were posh, decorated with things like textiles, feathers, silver, and gold. Now, llamas were also important for long-distance travel and trade. They could bear a weight load of up to 100 pounds, but were unsuitable for carrying humans. The chasqui have been mentioned before, but are important to bring up here due to their use of the Inca road system. If you recall, the chasqui were trained Inca runners that delivered messages and packages, typically quipus. The chasqui worked together like a relay system. One would run for a prescribed distance with oral messages, goods, and quipus, then pass them along to the next runner. They would work approximately 15-day shifts, residing in small huts called chasquihuasis set up along the roadsides. On average, they could cover 155 miles a day. Now, archaeologists have estimated that the delivery of a message from Quito to Cuzco, a distance of around 932 miles, involved 375 chasqui and took about a week. Now, I know this sounds like a long time, but it was so efficient that it even beat the horseback postal system established by the Spanish during colonial times. Additionally, they also had their own chasqui roadway system, which consisted of footpaths that provided shortcuts, so I'm sure this also helped with their timing of things. I spoke of tombos before, but they too are necessary to discuss when we're looking at Inca roadways and trade. Tombos, if you recall, were way stations or rest stops for designated personnel like military, traders, nobility, and even small ones for the chasqui. The tombos provided food and temporary rest areas during long journeys. It's estimated that more than 2,000 tambos were set up in the Inca Empire, spaced out at intervals of 12 miles. Now, they typically ranged in size from simple inns to cities which consisted of housing barracks, storage, and cooking facilities. Transportation by sea was never a goal for the Inca. The sea was primarily used for fishing, not transport. Fishermen created boats called balsas made from reeds woven together. Now, some of these boats got so large that they could hold 50 people at once. Now, similar boats were used on lakes and rivers in the inland, but again, not for transportation. So then, if not for transportation, how did the Inca cross rivers? Well, they actually had numerous methods for crossing rivers and canyons for that matter. For example, they created arroyos, which are floating bridges. These were large baskets that transported animals and humans using pulleys and ropes. The arroyas were made from totoro reeds tied to ropes, which allowed traffic to cross Lake Titicaca and nearby rivers. Additionally, the Inca also had two types of bridges that connected roadways separated by mountain passes. They had bridges constructed of logs for shorter distances and suspension bridges for crossing longer rivers and gorges. Now, the rope suspension bridges were made of cotton, grasses, saplings, as well as llama and alpaca fur all woven together. They would span as long as 165 feet. Now, this was longer than any suspension bridge in Europe made during that time. Garcilaso de la Vega described the rope-making process in 1604, during which he stated that they were basically just braids upon braids. With all this movement of goods and people, where did all this stuff end up? Well, given that all goods were technically property of the Inca state, most citizens did not have surplus to trade on their own. Now, there are some documentation of markets having existed at the local level, for example, women trading household surpluses like textiles and food, but we really don't have much more than that. Some archaeologists hypothesize that the Cayanca may have been the place where markets may have been set up, but we don't really have strong archaeological evidence for this. In all likelihood, all the goods ended up with the elite in storehouses throughout the empire. It was very important to store these surpluses for times of drought, famine, and environmental catastrophe. The kolkas not only housed these excess foods, but also housed gifts to be used in diplomatic transactions. For example, one chronicler witnessed seeing a kolka in Cuzco filled with 200,000 dried birds. Now, chroniclers estimated as many as 700 kolkas at a single site. For example, Hatun Chashu, an Inca provincial center, had around 2,700 kolkas. And as I've noted before, a majority of kolkas were found in highland sites due to the dryness which aided with preserving food. I wanted to reiterate a few key terms from lectures that closed a little while back. If you recall, the Mita were a rotational labor system that required heads of households to contribute to state projects. These included construction of buildings, dams, bridges, and roads, mining, military service, personal service to nobles, or the production of crafts. The Caraca would assign men to the Mita for several months at a time, and all men had to participate unless exempt. Now, exemptions included royal status, old age, or disability. The Yanacuna were men permanently relocated from their home to work full-time for the Sapa Inca to meet the personal needs of the ruler, so they could also attend to the royal agricultural fields or aid in the care of royal mummies. Essentially, they worked as servants for the elite. The Sapa Inca could have as many as a dozen to 100 Yanacunas working for him at one time. Camayos were skilled laborers who worked full-time in a designated area of specialization. For example, Quipu Camayos, Coca Camayos, and Quero Camayos. They were completely self-sufficient and were typically the sons of local elites. They could own their own homes and farmlands. Now, the Mitmakuna were individuals relocated from their homes to work in foreign lands. Some served as Camayos or Yanacuna and had to dress in the clothing of their homeland. Basically, they were used by the empire to reinforce their presence as a means of imposing authority. All items necessary for survival were produced by members of the household unit. crafts included stone, wood, and bone tools, textiles, as well as ceramic cooking and serving wares. Men were typically responsible for hunting, fishing, cutting, and preparing hides, and women were responsible for weaving and cloth production. Now, like younger children, ceramics too were also made by both men and women. So of quick note is that household items did vary according to region as well as household duties. Whereas household production was meant to be used by a single small family unit, state-level craft production was on a much larger scale. Production and distribution of specialized goods was controlled by the state. Each state workshop focused on the production of a single item. So this could be textiles, clays, metallurgy, stone, or feathers. Now, the state maintained its imperial control via design. So this is going to be a bit of a hard left turn, but it just dawned on me that we never covered measurements in the math lecture, and I really want to spend a couple of minutes discussing this because I find it to be very interesting. Inca measurements were established according to relative proportions. So small measurements were calculated according to the body and its movements. For example, the smallest unit was called a rocana, which is the length of a finger. The largest was called the rikra, which was the distance of the average man's outstretched hands, which is approximately 63.7 inches. Now, very interestingly, this was used as the base unit for many architectural constructions in Cuzco. Relative measurements were also used for longer distances. For example, the thought key was a pace or a full step of a foot, and the tupu was 6,000 paces, which was equivalent to 3.7 to 5.6 miles. Obviously, there was a high degree of variability and error with that particular measurement. Now, liquid measurements were registered according to a dry grain measure called a koyo, which equals to about 3.8 liters. Now, weight was determined using an isana or pan balance. Basically, maize or quinoa were parceled out evenly into large gourds that had the approximate value of about 28 liters. Now, your challenge is to figure out how tall you are based on the rikra, which was on the previous slide. I am about 1.3 outstretched hands of an average Inca man, so I challenge you to figure out the same.